Welcome back to Secret Weapons, and today we're taking a look at the Vongon Replay. We're doing something completely different on this channel today. We are talking about a synthesizer, and not some synth pedal where you plug your guitar in, it hears the audio and creates synth notes from that audio. We are talking about a proper synthesizer. This is the Replay by Vongon. It is a vintage-inspired polyphonic digital synth in the kind of like footsteps and lineage of something like a Juno. And it is very much in that Vongon aesthetic style of absolutely rad looking, down to very cool clicky buttons. And two, it is a deeply versatile piece of gear, and if you are a guitar player, I highly recommend that you invest in some kind of synth, whether it's this or something else, because I think having a synth is more important than you realize it is as a guitar player. And it's worth noting, I'm not saying that because we're talking about a synth in this video. If you've been kind of listening to my channel for the last month or so, you may have noticed an increase in synth activity on the channel in general, whether it's synth bass, kind of soft dreamy arpeggios running in the background of tracks, or a lot of times during this part of the video where I'm talking and there's a music bed like this right now. Recently, it's been more and more electronic focused, kind of dreamy ambient soundscaping from synth sounds, and they've all been the Replay. I've been using this thing on the channel since it showed up at the studio, and just not talking about it because it wasn't out yet. But I'm finding that these are sounds that I've been chasing down for a long time. In a sense, I've been trying to make my guitar sound like a keyboard for years now, but more specifically, I've kind of tried and bounced off of more and more synth involvement in my arrangements over the last year and a half or so, largely just because in the box DAW like virtual synths are difficult for me to get my head around for a couple of reasons. One being a lot of them can be just so aggressive in terms of like the features available to you, whether it's like wavetables and things that are esoteric madness that I will never understand, or if it's just the fact that it's difficult to turn virtual knobs when you're not familiar with the fundamentals of what you're doing. And to that end, I think that getting a real synth in some capacity, whether it's the Replay or something else, is really important if you're looking to kind of expand out your sonic palette for writing, producing, arranging, and everything else. And if you get a synthesizer with a really solid feature set, the Replay is one such synth, you can do some really interesting stuff with it. As you heard on that intro track, a lot of the more kind of like intricate and complex stuff relative to the arrangement being performed in that track was, as you saw, on a guitar, but that was not a conventional guitar. That was a Jamstik MIDI guitar, and I was sending MIDI notes to the MIDI scroll in my DAW, which was in turn and in real time sending that data out to the synth, and all of the audio from that guitar was actually being generated in the oscillator in this synth. Which is great because I am very much not a keyboard player. I took piano in like middle school, as we all did, but I didn't really stick with it. And the vast majority, 99% of the time that I'm touching my MIDI keyboard in this studio, I'm programming drums. I'm not playing piano. I'm not playing really even synth parts. I play really rudimentary, simple pads and whatnot, but being able to get something where you can kind of like interject your guitar sensibilities, your chord shapes, your muscle memory into something like this kind of opens up some really beautiful sound palette options. But enough about the why. Let's talk about the Vongon Replay itself. This is polyphonic. It is mono out, but it is balanced instrument level output. Works great with your guitar pedals, and to that extent, the power on the back here actually takes 9-volt pedal power, making this something that you could literally build an entire pedal board around using only pedal power for your synth and everything else that you'd be using with that synth, which is really cool. You can kind of break up the synth itself into a series of sections. You have your LFO, your low frequency oscillator, which is going to basically be the slow moving waveform that kind of powers almost everything else in this device. You have your oscillator section, your voltage controlled filter section, your VCA, and your envelope with your ADSR right here. That's going to be the kind of stuff that changes the shape of the notes, the attack, the decay, the sustain, and the release. On the right side, you have your volume, as well as a really incredibly cool and useful ARP system, including like latching or keyed arpeggios that can be up, down, in the order that you played it, or random. You have a 2.5 octave keyboard and octave down, octave up buttons on the left side, giving you kind of like your full range of notes that you might need, and a couple of really cool ways of really finding complex and interesting sounds. We're gonna start simple in our sound samples, looking at some really basic waveforms, but between your pulse width modifier, your noise, your white noise control, and a bunch of other really interesting applications, you can create some really complex and beautiful synth sounds in this device. So I don't want to talk about it a lot more because if you want to hear somebody really talk about this, I'm going to link to Matt Lowry's video down below because he is a genius and he's really good at this kind of stuff in ways that I am not. But guitar players, hear me. Whether it's the replay or something else, you need a synthesizer. Let's get into it. So one more kind of quick note I want to add at the end of the video here, not the end of the video, but the end of my edit of the video, just making sure that I kind of cover bases of things that I think are important to talk about. One is the actual physical hardware of the device itself. On the back you have a instrument level balanced output, as well as a white noise input. So if you don't want that kind of white noise, you can actually give it a different white noise source that will play on that knob. What else is important? You have MIDI in and MIDI out, as well as MIDI over USB. And the thing about that USB, you may have noticed on that intro track, some of the kind of guitar powering the synth sounds that we were making didn't necessarily seem like they were perfectly aligned in the footage, as well as some of the synth bass I was playing on the last section of the song. You may have noticed that some of that stuff was a little bit out of time with what the video was showing, and there's a reason for that. I've talked about the fact that I'm not a keys player, and the Vongon Rewind, with having the output as well as the USB out, allowed me to basically play the keyboard for that synth bass to a MIDI scroll and the audio recording at the same time. And so I basically was able to listen to my performance and listen to the engine while I was playing it, but I was also then able to go back and quantize and clean up my performance and then just hit record again, and the MIDI scroll in Luna then replayed the bass, there's the name of the pedal, or the name of the synth, replayed the performance fixed back through the synth once again and re-recorded the audio. So I was able to play that guitar stuff, saving all those notes with the USB output of that MIDI Jamstik guitar, as well as playing that synth bass kind of sloppily and on the first take, fix it in the MIDI scroll in my DAW, and then have the synth basically play it back for me, but corrected, which, again, if you're a guitar player and you're not a keys player like I am, and sometimes your ambition for a part outpaces your kind of dexterity as a keys player, something like this is incredibly cool. So that's all I wanted to say. Let's get back to the video. So I'm of the opinion that the best way to go about this is probably to kind of stick to mostly what's available on the device itself. There is an editor over USB, as well as a bunch of submenu controls by holding this Alt button and clicking different keys to access things like additional LFO waveforms and a couple extra oscillator wave shapes as well. But for what we're doing, and for kind of like the non-synthesizer user getting into the idea of a synthesizer, what I want to do for both kind of clarity and brevity is to kind of run through what's on the face here as best I'm able to, and then pull up some sounds I really like, but then more importantly, grab some pedals and plug some pedals into this output right here and kind of showcase where I think a lot of the value in sound design comes from on this device. So let's get into it. At its very, very core here, you have the LFO right here. And this is the low frequency oscillator that basically acts as a control, like an invisible hand controlling parameters across the board. By itself, we have our square wave right now, and it just sounds like this. Or your triangle, or your ramp. Let's start that over. So I think the best way to go about this as a non-synth user, I assume predominantly talking to non-synth users, is to kind of look at it for what is on the face of the device itself. This USB cable right here will allow you to access a whole suite of additional controls in kind of a desktop editor, all of which can also be accessed by holding Alt and pressing different keys to access kind of submenu controls across the device itself. But I'm not a keys player. A lot of the people watching this video are probably also not keys players. Again, I'm going to say 1,000 times, go watch Matt Lowry's video on this. I think it's incredibly useful. But so what I want to do in this video is walk through what I like, some kind of core functionality of the replay itself, and then get some pedals in the mix to showcase why I think a synth is such a compelling piece of gear for sound design, especially if you are, in fact, a guitar player. Let's get into it. So right now we have everything as simple and as straightforward as humanly possible. We have a sine wave with the LFO basically off, and it sounds like this. Very, very basic, very, very straightforward. You have your envelope right here. You have your LFO, your oscillators, your voltage controlled filter, and a lot of this stuff kind of moves from left to right, in my opinion, is how I choose to kind of like interpret a lot of this. But this LFO over here is basically the rate of your LFO, the delay of the onset of the LFO itself when a note is pressed. So, and then the LFO, as you can kind of like barely half read on this text. This is the amount the LFO is applied to your oscillator, and the amount the LFO is applied to your voltage controlled filter. And what that effectively means is if this is your rate control right here, this is the depth of it applied to the oscillator, which is going to translate as pitch modulation on the notes themselves. And over here, it is the amount that LFO, this rate control, is going to interact with the filter itself. So let's go ahead and take a look at what that means. So let's open up our filter enough. Turn up this oscillator, and the oscillator, if you don't know, a low frequency oscillator is basically a waveform moving so slow it's below the range of human hearing, and instead basically functions as an invisible hand controlling a parameter kind of back and forth very, very quickly or slowly. So if we've got our chord, let's go ahead and play. As you can hear, you have this oscillator moving. And so that is going to be the amount of that rate. That's going to be the depth of it, kind of like applying pitch modulation. And like I said, the delay right here is the amount of time it takes to onset. So a good way to be able to kind of like identify that as well is by applying it to, like I said, this filter over here instead. The depth of that oscillator opening and closing your filter. And And then of course, you can hear that delay is how long it takes to kind of basically take this knob from 0 to its kind of position is a good way of thinking about that. So if you've got that turned all the way up and no delay, it slowly fades in, which has some cool kind of like some cool stuff that you can do with it. Especially if you turn up that release. So that's the basics of the LFO. The actual sound of the synthesizer itself is basically a combination of the waveform right here, your square, your ramp up, nothing in the middle, or a few additional options available in the editor and submenu controls. But at its very basic, you've got a ramp up and a square. And then just for good measure, let's go ahead and open this up. You also have a triangle. And a sine wave. Whoop, and a sine wave. And then from there, let's go back to our square because I like our square. You have 3 additional kind of controls here. Obviously, you have your LFO for modulating that waveform. You have pulse width modulation, which can be thought of as kind of like the duty cycle of the waveform. Can be really cool for creating some like additional shape and texture if you're playing kind of like more like synth bassy kind of stuff. Like. And then your noise control, which is just white noise. I mean, literally. That's one of those things that took me a long time to understand the value of in a synthesizer, is like why you would want white noise, but it actually ends up being incredibly useful, especially with this voltage controlled filter, this low pass filter, which we will get to in a second. But even across those 3 things, you've got the ability to And again, we have not even gotten into the right 2/3 of this device. Let's take a look at this filter right here. As you heard earlier, this is your low pass filter with a resonance control. let's take the LFO out of that equation right now. Let's stick with kind of that synth engine, that synth sound we've built. As you can hear, when the filter is completely open, it can be somewhat abrasive, especially if you kind of climb the octaves. And with a low-pass filter like this, your resonance is going to kind of create a stronger peak, like a more resonant peak where that filter cuts off. But a consequence of it is it's also going to de-emphasize low range, which can be helpful if you're playing lower chords and you want to kind of avoid them being too muddy without having to reach for an EQ pedal or have to carve out lows in post. So full frequency range, all the lows, all the highs. Ability to carve out some highs. Ability to tame those low, that treble. And a fun consequence of that resonance is at maximum, it can self-oscillate, which is really interesting because when you turn off the oscillator, you actually can turn up this keyboard control all the way. Anyways, just a funny thing. That's basically the input of the keyboard itself to the filter, and that filter allowing that kind of self-oscillation to happen, which is really interesting. If you have your filter entirely off, which you have your noise all the way up, you can still get noise. There are some values for that, I promise. But okay, so let's go ahead and kind of go back to where we were and fine-tune this section right here. That's basically going to let you bypass some of this filter, which is really interesting in this kind of like setup. And then this is the voltage controlled filter being sent to the shape of the envelope as well. Let's talk about the envelope right here, this ADSR. This is going to be your attack, the onset of your note. Let's go ahead and open everything back up. This is going to be your decay, which is, this is going to be your decay, your sustain, and your release. The decay is the amount of time it takes for the attack to get to the sustain being the volume that the note will live at. So You can hear that. You can basically have it so the note onsets immediately, and then slowly, kind of like at however fast you have this set, makes it to the sustain level. So as you can hear, the sustain is at 0, so the note is not going to live forever, but this controls how slowly it gets from the onset to that final level. And it will now very slowly decay. But anytime I let go, and it immediately goes away because our release is at minimum. And that release is where you start to get that really kind of beautiful kind of decay and sustain of notes. And again, we talk about that white noise. Let's listen to the difference of. Bringing that white noise back in. Yeah, there's so much cool stuff there. Let's go ahead and get to the arpeggio, and then we'll kind of swing back through a couple of additional things that we haven't touched on yet. The arpeggio has a range of 1 to 3 octaves based on the notes you play. It can be off, keyed, or latching, and then it can play up, down, the order you played, or random. So keyed basically means while I'm holding the notes down, and latching means I can let go and it will just keep playing. Add an octave, add 2 octaves. The order I play it in. Or random. Yeah, that's kind of the basics. You have your rate control for your ARP. It can also be MIDI clocked to your project or a drum machine or your MIDI controller or anything else. And that is kind of like the basic overview of the device itself. Oh, before we forget, you have your voltage controlled amplifier right here. And that is basically the amount of volume that the VCA is capable of kind of putting out. And then you've got a gate, the envelope itself, or a gate with the release. So you basically have the option of being able to kind of craft whatever that waveform you want. Or just have it be a gate where none of this goes into effect. Just on and off. Or a gate where that release is still in play. So just an additional little bit of control. In my use so far, I find that I pretty much just like set it at envelope and leave it alone because I like that envelope. It's very, very helpful. The ADSR is what makes synths so very cool. So we've talked about the kind of like basic interaction and functionality of this thing. We've heard some of the really cool use cases and everything. Okay, as you can see, we have made the jump. We have now patched our synth from the input on the patch bay and instead to the Condor, the Mood, and the Vongon Ultrasheer reverb and vibrato. So let's see why this is so much more fun. Obviously, you already have your high pass filter or your low pass filter with a little bit of like high cut via that resonance control. But it can be very nice to have a proper that can just be nice for kind of like fine tuning stuff, which I really, really like, especially when I'm getting into like the synth-based territory. Now let's take this and get into kind of, like I said, like that sound design area, that thing that's really inspiring about this. So you've got like these chords. Carve out some lows with the Condor. synths and pedals. It's an important combination.